Welcome to the Convocation Interview Series, hosted by Berea College and produced by Apollon, the undergraduate e-journal. Apollon's mission is to publish superior examples of undergraduate humanities research, as well as fully utilize the e-journal format through image, text, and sound. In the spirit of this mission, the Convocation Interview Series provides Berea College students the opportunity to engage in conversation with a diverse calendar of speakers and performers. The expertise of these speakers and performers provides a valuable resource, as well as the opportunity to connect the role of the public intellectual to the college environment. Hello, and welcome to the first installment of the Fall 2011 Convocation Interview Series. My name is David Cornett. I'm the coordinator of the Apollon Interview Series. Today, we are fortunate enough to have the opportunity to speak with the president of Berea College, Dr. Larry Shinn. Our student interviewers are Sean Littoral and Eric Holmes. Would you please introduce yourselves?
My name is Eric Holmes. I'm a Spanish major from Sweet Home, Oregon.
My name is Sean Littoral. I'm a philosophy and sociology major from Columbus, Ohio.
All right. Sean, would you begin with our first question?
Sure. So, President Shinn, at what point in your life did you feel that studying religion was something that you were to aspire to?
Very good question. Well, I grew up in a small church, a small little Methodist church in the country outside of Alliance, Ohio. And my mother was the organist. And what I saw in that little church discouraged me from ever becoming religious. I learned all the songs. I learned how to be religious. I learned how people prayed. I sat through some very, very boring sermons. So when I went off to college, I was very conflicted. I had this history of being raised in a family that thought the church was very, very important, but me not always seeing those beliefs carried out in practice. So in my first year at the school in Berea, Ohio, called Baldwin Wallace College, the person who was assigned as my advisor was a man named John Trevor, who was the first one to correctly identify the Dead Sea Scrolls, this intertestamental literature, back in the 1940s when he was a graduate student at Yale. And so I had him as my mentor, and I took a variety of classes. I took actually French. I'd had Spanish in high school. I took French. I took biology and history, but I also took one of his religion courses. And what I found was a perspective on religion that I'd never known before. I'd been raised in a biblical literal environment. Every word in the Bible is true, exactly as it's presented. That didn't make any sense to me. I saw two creation stories, not one creation story, and so on. Did I have to believe that Mary was a virgin to believe that Jesus was the Son of God? Those kind of questions were very real questions to me. So this man opened up a whole new way of looking at the Bible, which we know today. And in fact, our religious emphasis speaker this fall at Berea, his book called The Heart of Christianity is a book in which he talks about the earlier tradition, biblical literalism, and then the emerging tradition of the last couple of hundred years, which takes a much more thoughtful and careful reading of the Bible, understanding it to be inspired by God, but understanding that these are the words of men and women, men mostly. So for me, my college experience, the classroom, and then seeing the example of my mentor, who was deeply engaged in the issues of the Middle East. He was very focused on helping Palestinians and started a program to send students abroad. So it was in that context, my wife and I ended up our first year out of graduation at Baldwin Wallace in a Quaker school in Ramallah, Jordan, which was among Muslims. I had many Jewish friends, but here I was all of a sudden exposed to a different part of the world. It was in that context where I encountered Muslims who were very faithful and Christians who were very faithful that my whole set of questions that I have spent the rest of my life studying have become real. So for me, that's a pretty long answer, but it's an answer of I went from being a very skeptical Christian to one who became a very cerebral Christian. And then across my life, and I could give you lots of stories, have encountered people who've made enormous difference because of their Christianity. And then I've tried to become a spiritual Christian.
Okay. The next question is for me. When you were first hired as president of Berea College, when you first got the news, when you were sitting in your home, what were your biggest aspirations for Berea College? What were you going to change and do to make this a better institution?
You know, that's a wonderful question because most search firms ask you that question. And I would submit, if you, before you have lived in a community, have ideas about how you want to change it, then you're going to be a terrible leader.
Okay.
And the reason is, don't know the history yet, haven't met the people, don't know what their strengths are, don't know what their weaknesses are. And in Berea's case, what I did was to read its history early on in its mission. And what my first decision was, how can we do a planning process that will help us achieve Berea's historic mission, not something that Larry Shinn brings to it. Nothing we have emphasized in my 18 years of Berea cannot be found in the Great Commitments. Every single element will be, of all the things that I've emphasized, internationalism, sustainability, think about the things that have happened, interracial commitment, all of those come directly out of Berea's mission. So I've seen my job as a leader to help inspire thought and then action to help us achieve better the 8 Great Commitments. And so I see my presidency as one not of bringing new ideas, but what we just saw, or what I just said in that convocation, which is I've tried to help us be about purposeful innovation. How do we go from 6% African American students to 18%? How do we go from a 46% graduation rate to 65% graduation rate? How do we go from 5 to 6% of our students studying abroad to 50% studying abroad? I viewed my contribution here to help us be inspired to apply what we already knew, but weren't doing as well as we could. So purposeful innovation is the way I would describe what I wouldn't have described in those words then, but I can say to you that my original talk when I was selected as a president, I was announced in, I think it was January 22nd or 23rd of 1994, came to Berea and gave a talk. And I quoted that quote from Dean Lewis Smith, Berea must always be and become. Then within 2 years, we developed our strategic plan and we sent out 12 different names that we might call it, and the community voted on being and becoming Berea College in the 21st century. So you've heard me end my convocation series with some of the same themes that I came with, because it's about Berea. It's not about me, and it's not about what I want. It's about what Berea needed. So I think what I brought is purposeful innovation.
Okay. All right. The next question, that's going to be for me. What made you decide to retire this year?
Good question. A plethora of 18-hour days and turning 70. I turned 70 in January. Now that's a simple answer, and is really not the whole answer. We went through some very difficult days in 2008 and 9 and 9 and 10, and I was actually going to retire then because I will be 70 here in just a little while. The 5 grandchildren, they were then at the ages of 7 to 12. They're now at the ages of 12 to 17, and they all live in Silver Spring, Maryland. So I want to be close to my family. My wife wants to be close to our family, and this job is all-consuming, right through the weekends. We love it, but it's time to get back a little bit to our family.
You mentioned earlier both the Great Commitments and the sustainability program at Berea, and I had a question actually planned to ask you regarding the Great Commitments and the one that mentions plain living, and whether or not that was the one that influenced you to implement a sustainability initiative at Berea.
Thank you very much. Yes and no. The outside world, as I was just describing, pushes upon us in ways that cause us to think differently about what our mission is, or what our tasks are. But if our mission also has elements where the wedding can occur, the way I describe it is this. If this is Berea College's mission, and you draw a circle, and you draw another circle that says, what are our strengths as a school? And then what does the outside world need? Where they overlap is your place of greatest leverage. And sustainability was one of those areas. We find it in the Great Commitments under plain living. That's actually, if we were to say, if all people in the world were asked to do one thing to make a difference in climate change and in terms of our gobbling up of all the natural resources, what is the one thing we would tell them, especially in America? Live more simply. Now, it wouldn't be simple like no hose allowed and the wool vest that I'm wearing, and you have one suit only, and that's all you wear. But when you think that we in America, a child in America the day she is born, or he is born, will use 32 times the natural resources that a child in India, where I've lived also, will use. That's unsustainable. Earth can't bear that. So I would say our sustainability initiative was inspired partly by my own interest. It's the one thing, if you say, what did you bring to Berea? That was sort of very heavily Larry Shinn. When I was a faculty member at Oberlin in 1977, I built a solar home, the first one in Ohio whose roof was solar panels. And I built the house myself. I had 10 days of carpenter help, and the rest was myself and my friends. And it was a 3,000 square foot home that provided 70% of its heating by solar panels. So I brought that interest, but there's a case where the president and the needs of society, along with the mission, overlapped.
That's excellent. What steps have you taken to ensure that your sustainability initiative carries on after you leave Berea College?
Again, a very good question. I was worried about this because I'll be honest with you. Except for a couple of people in facilities management, including the woman who headed up facilities management named Diane Kirby, and one faculty member, there was almost no support for my early conversations about sustainability, except among the students. The students were the impetus and were extremely helpful in my early years at Berea in pushing hard, and I encouraged them to push hard. The first money I ever gave, the first time I ever was asked to give a substantial amount of money to any group was a group of students who wanted $60,000, which was a lot of money in 1994, a lot of money today, but it's even a lot more money then, to put recycling containers around the campus, in every residence hall and so on. And we went from being off the bottom of the chart to the top 10 institutions in Kentucky in recycling because of student effort. And so students were a great help, but ultimately, now so to answer your question, I had great concern that if the whole institution didn't finally embrace sustainability, then when Larry Shinn leaves, so does sustainability. But just last year, we brought to fruition a 3-year project that includes students, faculty, and staff to create a new sustainability. It's called SOS2, a new sustainability initiative that passed the faculty by about a 90% to 10% margin, and it passed the Board of Trustees. And in that, we lay out for ourselves a future agenda that is very substantial, that's going to go on whether Larry Shinn's here or not. Secondly, okay, there's your map of what you're supposed to do, or your program. Who's going to do it? So we changed the actual title of the person who's going to be responsible and gave one of the vice presidents the responsibility for sustainability, and that's Steve Karcher. His title is no longer Vice President for Business Administration. It's a Vice President for Operations and Sustainability. He went to sustainability school this summer. He's already deeply engaged in this. He's going to have a sustainability committee. So there are people here. Faculty are committed. Many students are committed. That's always changing, but I find a lot of support by the students. Doesn't need Larry Shinn anymore.
So this last question is a bit self-serving for me, but
Wait, actually, Sean, can I take this one?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So, President Shinn, I don't think you're a naive man, so to think that you're going to go out with a perfect legacy would not be the case. What do you think your legacy is going to be? And if you could go back and change one thing about the past and your presidency, what would that one thing be and why?
Well, that's a very good question. First of all, legacies aren't known until the people who lived through the period are dead. So I don't think I can know what my legacy will be. I do know this, that I talked about, when you asked me the question, what you come in wanting to do? What I wanted to do was to help Berea, who was struggling a bit in achieving its mission, taking 75% of its applicants. Today we take 13%. That didn't happen by accident. Having 3 times as many African American students, that didn't happen by accident. But I wouldn't lift up any one of those. What I would say is the planning process that lifted up these elements one at a time. Sustainability, interracial commitment. Our Christian college commitment took 5 years to develop that little brochure of conversations with faculty, students, and staff called Berea's Christian Identity. 5 years of conversations, and I met with that group every single week for 5 years. So when I look at all those elements together, I think the legacy is to leave a stronger Berea than I inherited that still has lots of room for growth. It's not a perfect Berea. We didn't accomplish near all that I wish we could have. But I think the planning process itself is a legacy that I hope will continue. I mean, that is not clear to me. It'll depend who my successor is and how much she or he also understands that the leverage you have as a president is not what you say in public, only the bully pulpit speeches you give and so on. It's having people who work with you who believe that we're moving in the right direction and then work behind the scenes to make things happen. But you have to all be headed for the same island. And if those 5 people are working with me are headed for 5 different islands, we're not going to be a very integrated institution. So I think the thing that I've done is to lift up strategic thinking and planning, and then to try to ensure that each of the 8th grade commitments got real attention during my presidency. What do I regret most? What's really interesting is that there are lots of little regrets along the way. The regrets about a particular appointment you make that turned out badly, or decisions you make when we were in the midst of this cutting back on our staff, and we made a good decision, which was to do an early retirement program, retirement incentive program. So all of a sudden we had 45 people retire. Now instead of having to let 65 people go, we closed down 65 positions, but only 9 of them had people in them. I think that how we would have talked about that, this is just in recent years, would have been different before the faculty. The faculty was very, very upset at that time with us letting people go, and why would that be true? Secondly, at that very same time, there's a student, as you know, Elizabeth Vega, and Dave Porter, the former provost, who made a big deal about my salary. And how could a person have this kind of salary, even though I was ranked in the bottom third of the salary list, that the faculty salaries were in the midpoint. I think something I would do different is say nothing about that. I chose to try to give information, and the reason I tried to give information was because, first of all, there was misinformation purposely being broadcast, but secondly, I wanted to also defend the integrity of the notion that if all of us are in the same market, then we all should, be in the same market. But if we're going to say the minister has to be poor and walk in rags because he's a minister, while people in the church are wearing fancy clothes and driving fancy cars, then it makes sense to me. So it was a principle that I was trying to fight for. I probably would have said nothing. I think that's probably the biggest mistake I made, was in commenting, because I don't set my salary. It's not like I give myself a salary. In fact, I have refused salary, and as some of you know, I gave up a pretty good chunk of my salary 2 years ago, so that people at the bottom could have a higher minimum wage. But I think the way that was handled, the chair of the board should have been the person trying to defend a system that we didn't create, but that in the time of financial stress, those were the right questions to ask. And so I'm not upset that anybody asked the question. I'm disappointed some people chose to give misinformation. But how I handled that could have been handled differently. And that is, you all make up your own mind. The only thing is there wouldn't have been other information on the table. So most of the things that I really regret, I can't talk about because they're confidential. and that's going to be true with almost anybody who leaves a position like this. If I just made a different decision there, and that's because it involves people. That's the reason I can't talk about it. But I think what every one of us has to do is be fairly humble about our capacity to make mistakes. And every one of us makes mistakes, and I do all the time. And I tell new people, I've got 2 new vice presidents, make mistakes early, because you'll learn from them. You'll learn from your mistakes. You don't learn simply from what you know how to do well. So what is my legacy? I don't think any of us know and won't really know. And frankly, it's not my legacy. It's our legacy. It's the dozens and dozens of vice presidents, directors, student government leaders. We've had some great things happen where collectivities have made things happen. And so when you think about all those things I just mentioned, I didn't make any one of those happen by myself. I may have kicked a few people in the behinds to help them move along, but frankly, it's what we have done for the last 18 years, not what I've done. So it's our legacy, it's not my legacy.
Great, good response, Mr. President.
So kind of going back to this question, you mentioned sort of student action, and what would you pursue if you were a student leader, if you were student body president? What types of things would you pursue in the current state of Berea College?
Well, first of all, and actually we've talked a little bit about this, Sean. I think the danger of any leader coming in is to say, here's what I want to get accomplished, without knowing where all the cupboard doors are and what's behind the cupboard doors. None of us could have guessed when you were elected that this foundation called the Animate Charitable Trust was going to cause us to think in different ways about expanding our student body.
Right.
And yet now you're going to be at that table as the president of the Student Government Association. That's because the circumstance provides for you that opportunity. So the way I think about this is, what do the students want? What are the things that matter to students? You should know that. You should pay attention to that. What's happened in the past and what's been handed off to you? But what is the surrounding providing for you? And what it's providing for us, of course, is an opportunity to provide a Berea College education for another 400 to 600 students, and have someone help us pay for that. Now, I can't think of a greater legacy from a student government president than if you could be involved in a process that will ultimately produce, not during your and my lifetime, not just this year alone, a Berea that's 1,800 or 2,000 or 2,200 strong, that has the same intimacy but gives the opportunity to more students. Well, that isn't something that was on your agenda when you ran for president. So my sense is, you know that I believe this. If we walk side by side and we learn from each other, we work together, you're going to learn what I know and I'll learn what you know. So where I can be helpful to you in your student government area, I will be. And where you can be helpful to what's going on in the college, you will be. That's what a good student government leader ought to do, because now you're both trying to meet the needs of the students as they perceive them, but there's a lot of things students don't perceive, that is also, for example, how many students advise them to say, well, make more spaces for students. And that's not going to be necessarily something that comes out of a SGA meeting, and yet you would say, that makes sense to me. So I think listening carefully to your own college students, ask what have been the agendas of the past, and then what is this particular administration, what is this particular moment in our history, what does it allow? And you try to put those together. And so when you have the overlap of those three, I'd work hard on those.
Very nice. Thank you.
All right, well, that's all the time we have today. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
You're very well. You're very welcome. And thank you for having me.
Good
Appreciate
luck
it.
and everything after this.
Oh, thank you. Well, I got 10 more months here, and we're going to run real hard. And I must confess, it'll be a very, very big change for us. We love Berea. It's hard to imagine that I'm not going to be sitting at midnight at the kitchen table working on Berea business, but I won't be.
Right.
But you all will carry on. What year are you now?
I'm a sophomore.
Sophomore?
I'm a junior, actually.
Junior, okay. And I'm a junior as well. So you got a couple more years here, 3 more years. Well, take advantage of this place. It has enough diversity. You're going to hear enough conflicting voices. I was trying to say that as carefully as I could. There are enough conflicting voices in our community that we can be challenged. And the key is to allow yourself to be challenged, because that's how you learn. You learn when you're uncomfortable. You don't learn very much when you already know what the person's talking about. Good luck to you.